Welcome to the next episode of our show, Two Guys Discussing Russia Over Pastries. And today our guest is Oxana Shevel, professor at Tufts University. And we'll discuss not actually Russia, but Ukrainian politics, as we did recently. And we're coming back to the same question about corruption. And today our question is, which war Ukraine wins first? For territorial integrity or against the corruption? And as our guest, Oksana, floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to try to make an argument that Ukraine will win the war against corruption first, because I cannot think of a scenario whereby Putin would agree to give up Crimea, which would actually involve Ukraine, winning the war for territorial integrity. He said in a recent speech that Crimea has sacred value for Russia. And there is this whole narrative attached to how it is, always has been Russian, and now that Russia de facto holds it. I just cannot imagine sanctions or no sanctions that he will give it up. And the situation in the east is also complicated. I would say if only eastern Ukraine was in question, perhaps I would make an argument that territorial integrity would be restored first. But since it involves both Crimea and eastern Ukraine, I would say I don't quite see how that's going to happen. Now, corruption is also hard, but there are several things that I would say changed in Ukraine since the victory of Euromaidan that might make now victory against corruption possible. For one, there is really big societal demand for it. This is what overwhelmingly all opinion polls show. More so than, say, integration into Europe, more so than any other objective. People want the government cleaned up. And I think the new government realizes this, that their mandate is quite tentative, and if they don't deliver, I think there is a danger that I think they realize that they may be kicked out, just like Yanukovych was kicked out. And secondly, I think Western governments, again, quite uniformly are prepared to support anti-corruption reform measures. So if there was ever an opportune time for Ukraine to get financial aid for these kinds of purposes, I think now would be the time to do this. There are some positive signs we've seen already. Some people, Western people with foreign countries who actually for the first time in Ukrainian history were appointed ministers of finance, sector, and several others. And I think just today it was announced that Ukrainian anti-corruption bureaucrats will study in Singapore. So now Ukraine is actually modeling itself on the Singaporean anti-corruption agency. So the president went to Singapore, met with some officials there, and announced that Ukrainian bureaucrats will go to study in Singapore. So all of these things combined, I think, give some reason for optimism that even though it is still quite an optimistic prediction, I could imagine that happening, but I can't quite imagine Russia giving up Crimea and Ukraine restoring territorial integrity.
Okay, so you're quite optimistic on corruption and pessimistic about territorial integrity. What would you say, Paul?
Well, since the point of our show is to provide alternative opinions and explanations, I agree with Oksana, first of all, that both of these things are rather hard to imagine, either Ukraine restoring its territorial integrity or successfully fighting corruption. But let me make an argument for Putin giving up Crimea. And I think the drivers for that would be, first of all, the economic situation in Russia, that clearly sanctions have been important for cutting off financing for Russian banks and for Russian investment in development of the oil industry. But obviously more important than the sanctions has been the drop in the oil price that we've seen in the last several months. And it's likely that oil prices will be low, at least for the foreseeable future, one year or 2 years into the future. During that time, I think the EU and Asia will find other sources of energy. There's more energy coming online, and they'll be able to increasingly, as we look farther and farther into the future, use alternative sources of energy. So Russia will be in a much weakened position, and so Putin will not have the resources that he needs, on one hand, to keep his population happy, on the other hand, to support the war effort in eastern Ukraine and to support a very difficult situation in Crimea, where obviously he's brought to power there basically organized criminals who have very little legitimate support among the population. There's growing tension with Crimean Tatars there. So it's going to be increasingly difficult for Putin to hold on to that. So I think first step, he'll pull his troops back out of Donetsk and Luhansk as a necessary measure. And then in Crimea, it'll be a very difficult situation, but I think what he'll ultimately do is negotiate a deal with Poroshenko that there's some sort of shared sovereignty of Crimea, which Russia basically gives the sovereignty back to Ukraine, but maintains a huge amount of influence through its military base there and through a variety of other non-governmental organizations and things like that. So technically it'll be part of Ukraine, but in practice it'll essentially function as a part of Russia. And so you'll have this very strange, innovative solution where, since neither side can give up Ukraine right now, neither Putin nor Poroshenko, they'll come up with this kind of quasi-sovereignty for Crimea.
And may I push you a little bit further and ask you to imagine life after Putin? And what will be the scenario then about corruption and territorial integrity?
To me, the scenario you outlined, I could imagine it, but I think it would have to be after Putin for something like this to happen, because I just can't quite imagine, given that Putin spent so much of his capital on this rhetoric of how Crimea, belongs to Russia historically, sort of existentially, and essentially, there is a law now in Russia that says it's part of Russia. So I think for any kind of shared sovereignty that you are envisioning, this law would have to be repealed, right? So Putin would essentially have to say, I was wrong by doing this, let's now do something else. I don't quite see that happening. I think his domestic support would also suffer. I could imagine this scenario really looking down the road kind of past Putin, with the new leader coming in, if Russia's economy indeed weakened by sanctions, if the oil prices are low, if Russia is internationally isolated, and sort of, people are kind of beginning to forget a little bit the patriotic frenzy, maybe then some kind of arrangement like this might happen. But I still think that, the fight against corruption is more likely to succeed short term, because it is really a short term project. I mean, for Ukraine, it's not an option to wait on the fight against corruption for like next, 10, 15, 14 years. I mean, it really has to take place, I would say, in the next year or 2 or 3, right? So in a way, we'll probably have to know the answer to this question in a couple of years, and we can revisit, have some more pastry and figure out who's right.
That's the most radical optimism we, until now, we had on our TV show. Our experts came to different conclusions, even in regard to Ukrainian question. So we'll flip the coin and decide who's right and who's wrong. So we have a coffee pot on one side of Saudi Arabian dirham and 1 dirham on the other side. And our guest, what would you choose?
I'll go with the coffee pot.
Coffee pot. And it is 1 dirham. So. Good news is that Ukraine will restore its territorial integrity before fighting corruption.
At least something positive will happen.
Thank you very much for participating.